we as Christians celebrate the birth of hope. But it's interesting, out of the 4 gospel writers, only 2 of them chose to tell us this particular story. And you've heard me say this many, many times. Those 2 gospel writers were Matthew and Luke. Now, what's also really interesting is if you take Matthew's story of the birth of Jesus and put it right alongside Luke's story of the birth of Jesus, you're going to discover that they are dramatically different. The details are very, very different. There are some common denominators. Certainly both stories focus in on the fact that Jesus was born. That's an important common denominator. But there's not really a lot of similarity between the 2 stories. There is one other similar thing between Matthew and Luke's story, and that is both of these writers ground their Christmas story in the words, "in the days when Herod was king." Matthew talks about Herod in the 2nd chapter of his story. Luke mentions Herod in the 1st chapter of his story. But both of them want us to know that Jesus was born when Herod was king. Now, we just kind of gloss right over that. But for Matthew and Luke, they mention Herod because that's important to them. Matthew and Luke want us to know that Jesus was born in the days when Herod was king, because that was a period of time for the Israelites when there was extreme cruelty and tyranny and injustice. So Matthew and Luke mention Herod because they want us to know that Christ was born at a bad time. A time when Herod was king. Now, he was called Herod the Great. But that was not the judgment of history. He was called Herod the Great, usually by his friends, because they were told it was most expedient for them to refer to him with that title. Herod was a puppet king who ruled through the good graces of Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was mentioned in the reading tonight in Luke's story. Herod came to power when he was 25 years old. He came to power by assassinating all his political opponents. Then he bribed Mark Antony to put a good word in with Caesar Augustus for Herod. To show Caesar Augustus that he was worthy of ruling, Herod set out to pursue all the Jewish freedom fighters in the area. He pursued them to the caves around the Dead Sea. They hid in the caves and they wouldn't come out. And so Herod and his army just sat there. And then they decided to smoke them out. So they started a lot of fires and they started to smoke out these freedom fighters. And when the freedom fighters came out with their hands up, Herod slaughtered them all. That caught Caesar Augustus' eye. And so he gave Herod official reign of the territory. And that's when Herod really started to get mean. After Herod became king of the area, he became insecure in many ways. And he started sensing that his wife was involved in a coup that would take him off the throne. So he had her murdered. Her name was Marianne. I suppose Herod figured that he could do without one wife because he had 9 other wives. And not long after he bumped off his one wife, then he had his 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, murdered because he sensed that they too wanted his throne. Didn't stop there. He proceeded on. He eliminated about 300 of his top officers because he suspected that they were somehow in these attempted coups. And any leading Jewish citizen, they too were eliminated. We know that there were thousands of people who were killed because of Herod. He was a tyrant, an unstable man. And you get a sense of that in Matthew's story when Matthew tells us about the slaughtering of those children in Bethlehem, and because one of them might be a king. In those days, there was a common saying that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his friend. And that was what the climate was like. Informants all over the place, and in every gathering of people, people commonly disappearing, never to return again. That's what it was like in the days when Herod was king. And there are some who would say, you know, the world today really hasn't changed much. Herod's tyranny is still present in our world today. Herod's atrocities are still present in our world today. There is cruelty and injustice wherever you look. Matthew and Luke wants everyone to know that Christ came in the days when Herod was king. He came in a bad period of time. Herod's atrocities didn't cease. Cruelty didn't go away. And so tonight, we find ourselves perhaps in a similar setting in some ways. And we're wondering the same thing that the people back then wondered. When will there be peace and justice and equity? When will there no longer be war? When will everyone be respected? When will there be a time without disease? When will there be a time when political parties on Capitol Hill stop pointing the finger at each other and blaming each other and start working together? When will there be a time when police departments in major cities will be respected by all persons of color, and they in turn respect all persons of color? We wonder about this time in the midst of Christmas, in the midst of Christ's birth. But even though we wonder, we also tend to romanticize this time, don't we? We talk about treetops glistening, children listening. Well, that's crazy. I mean, when treetops glisten, usually it's because it's full of ice, and that's bad. And children never listen at this time. We talk about wandering men at night. Well, in today's world, wandering men usually get picked up. And we talk about roasting chestnuts over an open fire. Well, if you've ever done that, you know that they really don't taste very good. And we talk about a virgin birth and angels and giving birth in a barn. Well, that's no joy ride for sure. Yes, we romanticize our time. But in doing that, again, we miss the point that Matthew and Luke are trying to make. Christ was born in a bad time. Not a fairy tale time, but a time of injustice and cruelty and unfairness and sadness. And once we realize that, then hope begins to well up. Because you see, if Christ can be born in the days when Herod was king, then Christ can be born today and found today in the midst of some of the justices that we face in the world. One of my favorite authors is Robert Fulghum. Robert Fulghum writes a number of books, and in one of his books, he tells a story of a time when he just wasn't in the Christmas spirit. He said he just was not looking forward to Christmas at all. And he said in the midst of kind of plodding around in his house, when he was struggling with being down, he said he heard a knock on the door. And I want to read to you what he writes about this knock that happened on the door. Opening the door, resigned to accept whatever bad news lies in wait, I gazed upon a small person in a cheap Santa Claus mask carrying a large brown paper bag. "Trick or treat," shouted the masked Santa. Tongue-tied, I stared at this masked apparition as I dumbly fished out of my wallet a dollar bill and dropped it into the bag. Before I could ask what trick or treat had to do with Christmas, the small masked Santa asked, "Do you want to hear some Christmas carols?" Oh, I really didn't. But out of politeness, I said, "Sure." At which point, Santa launched into a rendition of Jingle Bells, followed by an equally enthusiastic rendition of Hark the Herry Angels Sing. And finally, this was followed by a reverential rendition of Silent Night. Head back and eyes closed, from the bottom of his little heart, this miniature Santa poured out the last verse, ending with the words, "Sleep in heavenly peace." Wet-eyed and dumbstruck, I pulled a $5 bill out of my wallet and dropped it into his paper bag. In return, he gave me a half of a candy cane and then turned and ran from my porch. Fulghum concludes with these words: God sent a child upon a starry night to a troubled and depressed world so that the world might know hope and joy. I never quite believed that, but I do believe in the masked Santa and his one-person choir singing Christmas carols and shouting "Trick or treat." I believe in him because through his visit, I've been treated to the joy of Christmas. Maybe Christmas is coming at a bad time for some of us. But God has a way of coming and knocking on our door, as he did Mary, Joseph, and the shepherds, and reminding us that we are not alone. We're not alone. And this is really the message that we celebrate on Christmas Day. In some parts of our world, Herod might still be reigning. And in many parts of our world, there is tyranny and oppression and death and sadness. But if Christ can be born in the days when Herod was king, then Christ can once again be born here and now. In our days, in our situations. And when we recognize that and hold on to that, then hope, the hope that we heard sung about during the offering, hope rises in our